Before you start this episode, this is just a reminder that History Hack does have a Patreon account and a Ko-fi account as well. You can either register to subscribe and throw us a few quid every month, or simply buy us enough caffeine to continue through to the next episode, because frankly, we run on fumes most of the time.
Hello and welcome to another episode of History Hack. I'm going down something that I actually have absolutely no knowledge of whatsoever, but I'm hoping today's guest, Dr. Andrew Ross, who is a writer and historian, will be able to tell me more about this, as he's here to talk to us about his new book, Donald Ross and the Highland Clearances. So Andrew, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
Thank you. Yes, I'm fine, thank you.
Okay, so who is Donald Ross and his family, and what are they up to in 1764 in Scotland?
Right, okay. Well, actually, the year 1764, that was the year that Donald's father was born. Donald Ross and his father was Donald Ross. So there were three Donald Rosses in a row. And they ran the mill on the Skibo Castle estate. That time in the 18th century, the mill was probably pretty small. It was probably what's called a horizontal click mill, which is just a simple horizontal paddle which was just put in the stream to turn a mill wheel, and it would have just been covered by a small turf hut. But in 1790, the mill was destroyed by a flood, and the miller then rebuilt the mill, this time in stone, and gave it a thatch roof and with an outside vertical water wheel. So more like the more modern water mills you tend to think of. And then after that, the Duke of Sutherland had a mill pond built, which meant that the water leading to the mill could be better regulated by a sluice gate. The mill pond's still there today, but the mill is long gone. But it does show that the mill actually served the local community and not just the Skibo estate. Now, Donald Ross, who, the main subject of the book, he was actually born in 1813. And he took over the mill when his father died in 1838. And the following year, he got married to May Bain. But this is quite unusual because she was actually 16 years older than him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's usually the other way round.
Absolutely. Very unusual. But this has actually been really helpful for checking the records because she also kept her maiden name. And Donald Ross is a pretty common name. So when looking through the censuses, finding him and his older wife with her original name is you're dead on with finding the right record. Yeah, and they had one daughter, but I believe she was adopted because she came from Wicken Caithness, and there's no family connection with that area.
Okay, so life for the family doesn't go too smoothly, does it? They end up getting evicted. What is the reason for their eviction, and how does it affect the family?
Yeah, it's quite a blow to them because, they were doing well. They had the mill and they also had a small farm, so they were getting income from the mill, and the farm enabled them to grow crops and keep cows, so they were completely self-sufficient as well. Yeah, and so they'd lost their income and way of living. Amazingly, they actually fought against their eviction in the courts, which was pretty well unheard of because most people, if they're evicted, they just disappeared. So the first eviction notices were served in 1841, not only to Donald's family, but also to his extended family, his mother and sisters, his brother's family, and his uncles. And they were living in 4 different houses in Clashmore at that time. And the reason they took them to court is because they thought they'd be able to get money back, because they had a letter that was written in 1792 from a previous laird, George Dempster, who basically said that if ever they were evicted, they were entitled to compensation. But the laird they were dealing with at the time was his nephew, and he argued that letter didn't apply to him because he hadn't written it. Anyway, so they actually had to leave the mill and farm in 1843, and they lost their case in the Dornoch Sheriff Court, but then they took the case to the Supreme Court in Edinburgh. And it dragged on for the next few years, but unfortunately they ultimately lost. But they did get some expenses back, so they didn't lose everything. But before the verdict, Donald was renting a house in Clashmore, and his mother and sisters went to live with him after they were evicted. But they didn't have any income, so to make ends meet, he actually resorted to forging bank bills in his brother-in-law's name. And He got into trouble. He was arrested and charged with 6 counts of forgery. But his brother-in-law actually legged it to America, so he didn't have to testify against him. And
Brilliant.
Donald luckily got let off with not proven. Otherwise, he could well have been deported to Australia or something like that.
Yeah.
But anyway, while he was in prison, he had all his furniture seized by the bank to pay off debts. Anyway.
Oh no.
So a bit of a rough time for him.
It seems like quite an extreme measure. It's like, well, we need some money. I know, let's just make some.
Yeah. It was a bit, yeah.
So what is the Glencalvy clearance and how were the Ross family involved?
Okay, well, I think I'd probably better explain a bit about the Highland Clearances in general, just in case any of your listeners don't know anything about it. So, yeah, I mean, the Highland Clearances is a pretty dark part of Scottish history, which people don't generally tend to hear about. It sort of started in the late 18th century, where landowners realised that actually sheep farming was more lucrative than just getting small rents from their local populations. But the problem is the two didn't go well together, and people had cattle, which they needed the pastures to feed on, but also, the pastures were needed for the sheep. So best way of dealing with that is that the landowners just got rid of the people, even though they'd been living there for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And the people didn't own the lands, they were just renting, and they didn't have leases, so they could be served eviction notices at any time and just given a couple of months to get out. And, if they refused and didn't leave, then they just set fire to their houses, which was pretty gruesome, really.
Pretty brutal, yeah.
Yeah. A major clearance that happened in Sutherland was in the early part of the 19th century in Strathnaver in Kildonan. And within about 8 years, 4,000 people were evicted.
Wow.
And, as a local stonemason reported on the evictions, and he climbed a hill and he described 250 houses on fire that he could see.
Wow, that's not a small number. No,
it's just awful. And, if you drive through those glens today, there's 1 or 2 cottages, but nothing, completely empty. And you just try and imagine that, that there are thousands of people living there 200 years ago. It's really, really hard to imagine. Anyway, so that's what's happening generally in Scotland, but a lot of the clearances weren't reported. Half of what went on we probably just will never know about. However, the Glencalvy clearance was the first one to actually be widely reported in the press. Basically because the Times sent a reporter who wrote a series of long articles, and suddenly for the first time people actually found out what was really going on up in the Highlands. So Glencalvy itself is a little glen in Rossshire, and where the Calvy burn runs into the River Carron. And so in 1842, the people were to be served eviction notices, but they resisted. And they intercepted the messenger, got the notices off him, and burnt them. So legally, they weren't able to be evicted without having the notices legally served on them. So that was a way of delaying the evictions. And this went on for a couple of years. Now they were finally evicted in 1845. They had nowhere to go, so they actually set up camp in the local graveyard of Croik Church and lived there for a while. And the local ministers got together an appeal in the newspapers for donations to help them. And Donald would join the list of people who were gathering money, gathering the donations to help the people. Yeah. It's quite an interesting little list of people. So it included the minister who had married Donald and his wife in Dornoch Cathedral, and also solicitor Charles Spence, who is actually the solicitor from Edinburgh who is defending Donald's family in their eviction case in the Supreme Court.
Oh wow!
Yeah. So yeah, after several months, the people finally dispersed from and found other places to live, but weren't doing particularly well.
No, Donald goes on to work within the Scottish Association for the Protection of the Poor, doesn't he?
That's right. So again, a bit of background to that. In 1845, the new Scottish Poor Law was introduced. Now, before then, it was the local parish churches who looked after the poor, and they distributed aid to the most needy, but that was ad hoc, and it varied from parish to parish. So the Poor Law was set up to make this a fairer system, but it didn't actually work out that way, because it's paid for by rates, and the more wealthy landowners were expected to pay the highest proportion of the rates for the relief payments. So it's pretty unpopular with them because they didn't really want to have to pay the money out.
Yeah, no changes there.
Yeah. And there was a local inspector of the poor who basically decided the cases and who was entitled to the payments and who wasn't for each of these parish areas. But often the local inspector was in the employ of the major landowners. So he was also employed to try and reduce the relief payments to as minimum as possible. So yeah, it's a pretty unfair system. And so the Scottish Association was set up to help the people that were being refused their relief payments. And Donald, and it's actually there's Charles Spence, the solicitor, who helped set that up. And there's two branches. There's one in Edinburgh and one in Glasgow. And Donald was employed as the agent for the Glasgow branch. And he became incredibly successful. Within 2 years, he helped over 1,500 people get relief payments, which were being withheld, which is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And he even took some of the local inspectors to court and won the 90% of his cases.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They often appeal, but again, lost their appeals. So that's pretty impressive.
That is
And
really
he didn't have any legal training.
That is really impressive for that time.
Yeah, absolutely. But he got complacent, and he supported. So people, he's doing so well that people were trying it on, and because he was dealing with so many cases. He wasn't that careful in actually checking the details, and he supported 3 cases in a row that turned out to be fraudulent by the court. No. And he was nearly arrested for aiding and abetting them. But unfortunately, the bad publicity meant that the actions of the association had to stop, and he lost his job over that.
Oh no.
Yeah.
But anyway, the problem when people are overworked, when you're overloaded with work.
you got a bit careless, and unfortunately,
But we get some more evictions, this time in Strathhead and an exodus from Borough, don't we?
So the poor people of Scotland, it was one thing after another with them. So in 1856, they were hit by the potato famine. So basically the potato blight came to Scotland and destroyed the potato crops. And that was their main source of food. The year before, it devastated Ireland. It's a lot worse in Ireland, and it was estimated that about 1 million people starved to death because of it.
Yeah. It was
pretty awful.
I mean, I had heard a small amount of the Scottish potato famine, but it's always overlooked in sort of popular memory by the Irish one because of the casualties. But it was no less devastating.
Yeah, although the people were helped. So there's a relief fund set up in Scotland to supply meal. But it wasn't just doled out. Unfortunately, the men had to work for it, building roads and bridges and digging ditches. And if for a day's work, they were only given 1 pound of meal, oatmeal or other kind of ground meal.
Yeah.
And if you had a large family, that was very little to actually live off.
And if you're burning calories building roads and things, you need more than that because you'll just starve to death.
Yeah, it wasn't good. I mean, they got through it, but it must have been pretty tough.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, some of the landowners took advantage of that. I mean, not even just they just give out the meal; they actually gave it out on credit, so that the people were expected to pay for it after when they got some money in the future. So yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah.
But anyway, so this fund was pretty scant, but at least it kept the people alive. But it stopped in 1850. And, see, the people had had to sell their cows, and they had no way of growing any crops because they'd failed. So suddenly there's no way of living. And then the landowners, suddenly had to, by the poor law, had to pay out to support an impoverished population. So their solution, well, get rid of them, clear them.
Yeah. There's no poor if we move them on.
Yeah. So it's a new wave of evictions. So so Donald heard that 600 people were going to be evicted from the Strathclyde Peninsula in Skye. So he went there to investigate. And for his investigations, he discovered that the process hadn't been done legally, and he complained about that. So the people weren't immediately evicted, but it just gave them a stay of execution for a couple of years, because then it was done properly, and they're kicked out a couple of years later. But at least, again, Donald publicised what was going on with that eviction. In Barra, similar situation. So 660 people were evicted. And somehow many of them managed to get to the mainland. And then they walked all the way to Inverness in Glasgow. I mean, that's,
wow.
100-mile walks. I mean, how they managed that, I just don't know, because, they had nothing to live off. And then, so they arrived in Glasgow, and they're coming to Donald's office trying to get money, but because they weren't living there, he couldn't help them.
Yeah.
And he actually took a party of refugees from Barra all the way to Edinburgh, because the landowner actually had a house there, and he took the refugees to the landowner's house, but he wasn't there at the time. He was at his castle in Aberdeen.
His second home.
Yeah. So some of the people sort of ended up in the houses of refuge and workhouses, and given a bit of employment here and there, but it's another great time.
Yeah. So I mean, we've touched on it a bit, but I think we should really look at this sort of closer. How dire are the poverty levels in the Highlands at this time?
Yeah. So at that time, it's pretty bad for the poor people who had nothing. I mean, it was just desperate. So they got rid of the cows during the famine, and didn't have any crops to grow because they hadn't got any seed. And then, and then nowhere to sustain themselves. And another problem was actually the crofting system itself. So that sort of started in the 1800s, where rather than having sort of shared farms, they were given their own little plot of land. But it's quite small, and even then, barely big enough to sustain a small family. But often the families got bigger and bigger, and then the crops got subdivided. So the plots for each of those families got smaller and smaller, effectively.
Yeah.
And then they're evicted, and if they couldn't find anywhere else to live, they often ended up being beggars, or ended up in the slums in the big towns and cities. There's some reports of starvation, but that was actually before recording of deaths became mandatory in 1855. So it was generally hushed up. So it was a pretty desperate time. I mean, any of the people that did have money before then, they'd already gone somewhere else. They'd emigrated to the colonies, and so it's just the poorest that were left behind who were really struggling.
I'm going to have to apologise for this, because as a naval historian, I always get distracted by boats and ships, and so when I saw this, I had to throw this question in. Can you tell us about the voyage of HMS Hercules?
Yeah, so that was one of the emigrant ships, and so another solution to get rid of the poor people was actually put them on ships and ship them to the colonies in North America and Australia. So in 1852, the Highland and Island Emigration Society was set up. to pay the fares for people who wanted to emigrate but couldn't. And that was overseen by the government. And in 5 years, the society actually assisted 5,000 people to emigrate, which is quite a lot. And one of the emigrant ships that they've funded was HMS Hercules.
Yeah.
And it's one of the first ships to leave. And the plan was to take 750 people to Australia. Donald was involved with that. He actually managed to get hold of 8,000 books to supply to the people so they had something to read for their journey, which was pretty amazing. And if you knew the schoolmaster was assigned to that ship very well, and so the schoolmaster was actually regularly writing to Donald to let him know how things were going, and then Donald published those letters in the newspaper. So we've got quite a detailed account of this particular case of an emigrant ship, but it didn't go at all well. It was really bad. So it actually set off on Boxing Day 1852 from Campbellton, and setting off in the heart of winter was really not a good move.
No, it's not a good time of year.
It also immediately ran into a storm, and the ship got damaged, and it had to berth at Rothesay for repairs. And it spent 2 weeks there getting repaired, and it set off again, ran into another storm, and had to set up set in at Cobb in Southern Ireland. But then fortunately smallpox and typhus broke out on board the ship, and a lot of people in a small space spread like wildfire. So all the people were actually taken off board the boat, and the sick were taken to hospital, and the remainder were put up in cramped accommodation. So more cases were breaking out. And of course, some of the people died, and unfortunately, including the doctor who was assigned to the ship. So it's pretty bad. And the ship was actually stuck there for 3 months.
Wow.
Yeah, and it set off with only half the passengers that it originally had. Because some of them had died, some of them were still ill and had to stay behind, and it felt that that half the passengers were well enough to take the journey, but even on the journey, some more cases of typhus broke out, and more died. Finally, the ship ended up. It managed to make it to Australia, but the journey took 7 months.
You have to go around. This is well before the Suez, so you have to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, and that's a long old trek.
Yeah. It stopped off at South Africa. Yeah.
You have to go up all the coast of East Africa and across down the Indian coast. You can't just peel across the Pacific. You've got to do port jumps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. 7 months the journey took, and only half the passengers got there. But the ones that had to stay behind, they were put on other ships, because a lot of them, some of the families got split up, with some people staying behind and some having to go on the ship. So they were sent along later on. But pretty great. And the people had never been on the boat before, so it's, a lot of them suffered seasickness, and there's babies born on board, and it's quite amazing.
We also in this sort of period, though, we have one of the last major wars that we're involved in Europe, which is the Crimean War. How does this affect the massacre of the Rosses?
Okay, right. Two things going on there. So if we start with the Crimean War, okay, so that started on the 27th of March, 1854, and basically Britain and France were fighting Russia in the Crimea, and it's probably best known for the suicidal charge of the Light Brigade. And
that's the one that stands out.
Yeah, and then it's also the time that Florence Nightingale went there to help the wounded. But it's also mentioning the Thin Red Line, and that's where the 93rd Sutherland Highlanders had just formed a line of men with rifles and stood their ground and amazingly repelled a 400-strong Russian cavalry charge. Yeah. It was quite a heroic event.
There's a famous painting of it, isn't there?
Oh, yeah, there is. Yes. Yeah. The Massacre of the Rosses. Right. Well, so this has affected the people of Greenyards in Strathcarron in Rossshire, which is actually not far from where the Glencowie clearance took place 10 years earlier. It was basically, the massacre itself was it happened 4 days after war broke out. And of course, everyone was more interested in what was going on in the war than what was going on in the Highlands.
Yeah.
So it's a good day to bury bad news.
That's what I was going to say. Always bury bad news.
Yeah. Anyway, so the people of Greenyards had actually been resisting eviction by the same method as used previously, which is intercepting the messengers and burning the eviction notices. But the landowners and the sheriff, they got pretty fed up with this, and the sheriff of Tain decided to set an example of them, and he got together a posse of 27 policemen from outside the district, so they didn't know the people, and he took them into Greenyards early in the morning of the 31st of March. However, the people had been tipped off, so they were waiting for them, and there was a crowd of 200 to 300 people from Greenyards and the surrounding area to intercept this posse of policemen. And the women were at the front, as they thought they'd be safe, because, no one would hurt the women, but they were so wrong.
Yeah.
The sheriff said, clear the way and knock them down, which was actually reported by witnesses. And the policemen rushed in with their batons and basically beat the hell out of them. And, some of the women were hit so hard that, these solid ash batons broke.
Wow.
And a lot of the women were just left for dead on the field, completely insenseless. Really, with blood pouring out their heads. It was really gruesome. But the local procurator fiscal, who was actually the cousin of the sheriff, had taken the men in, he immediately sent a doctor to dress their wounds and help the people. And the doctor actually wrote a very detailed report on the injuries that same day. And he reported of broken limbs and fractured skulls and deep gashes and awful.
Flashing back, my grandfather was a policeman, and we got his truncheon, and I know how hefty that is. So to the sort of damage you could do with one, right, let alone hit someone hard enough to break it in two, it's quite impressive. Yeah. Well, impressive force, but it must have been horrific.
Yeah. So Donald heard about what happened, and he went there and actually interviewed the victims, and he described in detail the injuries of 19 of the women. And again, he must have, the doctor may have still been there, because he clearly must have got some of the doctor's report and published some of it. And and he thought some of the women were so badly injured that they weren't going to live much longer. But actually, there's no evidence that any of them actually died. It was just before death records were had to be recorded. But there's no reports that any of them died. I actually did a look around the local graveyards and didn't find any of the names and dates that matched. We don't know. A couple of them may have died, we don't know, but there's no evidence that any of them actually did. And certainly, a couple of them, they went on to have large families. There's one woman who, she had a fractured skull, but she went on to get married and have a large family, and there's, got living relatives today.
Oh wow! I mean, that's good. I mean, a fractured skull, especially in that sort of time, the early mid 19th century, would probably be a death sentence. So to go on and do that's really good.
Yeah, I mean, it could have had, got infected and died of from infections.
Which leads, talking of women, this leads us on to who is Harriet Beecher Stowe?
Okay, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Yes, she was actually an American author, and she became famous for a book entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that highlighted slavery in America, at that time. And she successfully campaigned to end it. So she became famous because of that. In 1853, she embarked on a European tour, and she became a guest of the second Duke and Duchess of Sutherland. And she wrote a book about her travels, which was entitled Sunny Memories, which came out in 1854. But within it, she mentioned, how good the Duke and Duchess were for improving the prosperity of the people on their lands. But this inflamed a few people, including Donald, and he wrote to her to say, well, actually, what about the clearances? Why don't you go and visit the sites of the clearances in Sutherland and see the ruins of the people that were kicked out? So it's just a small connection with Donald and Harriet there, really.
Yeah. We've talked about immigration. There was quite a large sort of Scottish contingent that were emigrated towards Canada. So was Nova Scotia the new start that they'd hoped for?
Yeah. So I better put in the background of how they ended up in Nova Scotia. So in the mid 1850s there was a second wave of the potato famine, but there was no government supported funds set up to help the starving people. But Donald was pretty amazing. The Crimean War was still waging on, and there was a patriotic fund set up to help the soldiers in the Crimea. But the starving Highlanders were not being helped at all. So Donald campaigned tirelessly to raise money to help them, and he was incredibly successful. There was one particular group that helped him a lot, and that were the Quakers. Because they were actually against war. So they felt that they couldn't actually help the Patriotic Fund, but they could help starving Highlanders. So that they gave Donald quite a lot of money, and he raised a lot of money from elsewhere by lots of adverts in the newspapers. He published lots of pamphlets describing the situation there. So first of all, he supplied them with sacks and meal so that immediately stopped them from starving. But then to make sure to get them self-sufficient again, he then supplied them with hundreds of sacks of potatoes and seeds and vegetables, which they could plant, to be self-sufficient. He sent them bundles of clothes as well. And he even supplied a few fishing boats to the Isle of Skye. But he was actually taking 5% cut of the donations, so he was doing quite well out of it. But then, it's pretty like a director of a charity today getting a large salary. Yeah,
so I was thinking. I mean, he's doing a lot of legwork. It would be wrong in inverted commas to not take a little slice, to pay for his time and efforts.
But he and his family had to live while he was doing that.
Absolutely, yeah.
But he probably saved hundreds of people from starving to death, if not thousands.
Which is more important.
Yeah. But he unfortunately he became a victim of his own success. So by 1857, the people in Scotland, the poor people in the Hebrides in mainland Scotland, they had the best crop that they'd had in probably a decade, and that's because it supplied them with all the seed and vegetables and things for the year before. But he was still trying to make a living from the donations, and he wrote to a rich lady in London saying that about people on North Uist, that their crops had failed and they'd lost fishing boats and some men had drowned in a storm. And she then sent that letter to the Inverness Courier newspaper, and they thought, oh, this is terrible, we haven't heard about this. And they then wrote to the local minister and sheriff of North Uist. But they wrote back and said, everything's fine, we've had the best crops in over the years, and no one's drowned, there's not been a storm. And then, oh God. So then, that was it. So, this was plastered across the newspapers. Yeah, Donald's a fraud, don't give him any money. And suddenly, from doing well, his name was mud. And, he had to resign from the Glasgow Celtic Society, which had just helped set up. And, he legged it to Canada. But it didn't go well. I'm not sure where he went. Unfortunately, emigration records are pretty hit or miss. Not all of them kept. And Donald Ross is a common name. I haven't been able to find a match. I don't know where he left from, and I don't know where he went to. So it's impossible to know which ship he actually went out on. But anyway, there's a letter published in a newsletter of the Quakers saying that he'd become ill, and doctors have suggested that he moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where he'd get better treatment. And they set up a fund to help him, and actually, raised some money which they sent to him, and that enabled him and his family to get back on their feet. And he got employment as a bookkeeper for a merchant company. So and he lived there for the next 30 years until he died in 1882.
He's definitely a survivor, isn't he? He's had his life's really quite interesting. Lots of success, harrowing pitfalls, then rebuilds it all again. He's someone definitely to root for.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. Yeah, it's incredible. And of course, he was incredibly prolific at writing pamphlets and newspaper articles, which told his whole story. And then, added to that is all the court documents from the eviction case and the case in the Glasgow courts, and there's also other court cases related to the clearances. So it's managed to build up a really detailed picture of his life and what was going on in Scotland at that time.
And your book really presents it in quite an interesting way. It really intrigues the reader to read more. Like I said, I had a vague, I think I'd heard of the Glencoe massacre, which I don't think got much anything to do with this, and anything from Culloden up until a lot later, I didn't really know that much about Scottish history. So this has been, it's a really interesting study of social history of the Highlands and the economics of it, the way the landlords are treating the poor. It's just horrific.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I got really into it. I mean, I was born in England. My grandfather's born in Glasgow, but he died, many years before I was. And he lived in London, so we didn't know anything about the family history at all. And and Donald, just from checking the records in at the National Archives, getting the census and birth, marriage, and death records. So I had this name Donald Ross on my family tree for quite a few years, but it's a common name. Yeah. It was only by chance that I made the link that the Donald Ross in my family was this same one that went on to write all about the clearances and other things.
And like I said, he's such an amazing character with such an interesting life. It's really quite compelling reading.
Thank you. Yeah, fascinating. I mean, I did actually end up writing a lot more than's in the book, but I had to cut it down because there's a word limit for the book.
Yeah.
Plenty of other things I could have written about for that.
But if you want to redress the balance, if there's any stories that you had to leave out that you want to tell, you can go for it here if you want.
Yeah, the Neudart evictions. So this was the year before the massacre of the Rosses, and basically, so you got the population of Neudart, which is a peninsula in Scotland, but you can't actually get to it very easily from the mainland unless you sort of walk 20 miles. So the only way to get there is by boat, even now. And so the people in Neudart, they're pretty poor. Again, they'd lost a lot during the potato famine and are barely hanging on. And the landowner wanted rid of them, but they was actually willing to pay their fare to Canada. But they weren't given any choice. You had to leave. So it wasn't quite forced emigration, but it's more coerced emigration. So 332 people boarded a ship called the Scilly off the coast of Skye and set off for Canada. But there are a number of families who refused to leave. And basically the local managers just went round and pulled their houses down, and they just had to fend for them best as they could by just trying to rebuild small little huts. But every week, these little huts and poor little shelters got pulled down, And again, Donald heard about this, and he went there and wrote in detail about what had happened and what was happening to them. And this local Catholic minister as well was also helpful to them. Yeah. And Donald managed to get them tents, and they actually set up the tents in the grounds of the local Catholic church, and lived there for about 3 years in these tents.
Wow.
Before Donald was actually were able to raise money for them to immigrate to Canada to join their relatives.
It's just so heartbreaking to just, that one day you've got a nice, happy family farm. Suddenly some guy just just decides to come either force you to immigrate or just send some lads around to tear your house down. It's just horrific.
Yeah, no, it is horrific. I mean, I'm meant to say that not all the landowners were like that. That there were landowners who did look after people, like Mackenzie of Gairloch. He was good to his people. But yeah, really, a lot of the landowners are ones that had purchased the estates. So they had, and they were sort of from England, so they had no ties to the people, no historical ties, no sense of loyalty, and they just bought these estates to make money, and they weren't making money, and the people were in the way. And then but then it went pear-shaped anyway for them, because the sheep farming side of things failed. The sheep farmers moved away, but then the estates got converted into the hunting parks, deer parks for the rich.
I must admit, I genuinely really learned something today. That I think it's definitely one for the readers, for the listeners to go out and buy. And thanks for coming on and telling us about this. But could you remind everyone the title of your book and where they can get it from?
The book is called Donald Ross and the Highland Clearances, and the publishing date is the 15th of June by Amberley Publishing, but it's already available to pre-order from their website and other websites. And I hope people buy it and enjoy reading it.
And thanks for coming on.
That's all right. Thank you very much.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.